that for the majority of my projects, I start off with a sketch. That way I have a template, a map, something to follow so I know that I don't start doing crazy things without reason. For this project, I'm going to be using an array of different thicknesses of cardboard. Thicker ones like the packages you get in the mail, or thinner ones like cereal boxes, snack boxes, that sort of thing. But starting off with our thickest cardboard, we're going to be building the frame of our house. For this, I'm starting off with the back portion. That way I can use it as a template to create the front of my house. I am going to find the middle point of this block and create a very whimsical triangle. For this house, this is a witch's cottage, so I want it to look very whimsical, something that doesn't look very cookie cutter and clean like you would normally find a house. This is a house that has a lot of character in it. So I'm making sure that I'm curving a lot of my angles to add that whimsical flair. Now for cutting out my cardboard, I'm using an X-Acto knife. Make sure that you're using some paper or something underneath to make sure that you don't scratch up your surface. I'm also creating the sides of the house, and for this they're going to be the exact same. Using a glue gun, I am putting the two sides and the back together. I'm leaving off the front because this little house is going to have a door and it's going to have windows, and I figured it would be a lot easier to do that before attaching it. Using my ruler, I'm again just breaking things up into sections so I can make sure that things are as even as possible. I want it to look whimsical, but I don't want it to look messy. Now once I have this all attached, I'm going to be using some cardstock to create the roof. I'm using cardstock because I want to again have that more curved, whimsical look to it. I'm actually taping together a bunch of pieces of cardboard to make it slightly thicker, but you could also use some thinner cardboard, something that's just going to have a little bit of bend without creasing. And again, this part is very simple. I'm just gluing it to the frame. I'm also having this section at the front that is going to have its separate roof. So I'm just taking some of the cardstock that I had already used, some scraps, and building these pieces. I also have a third, smaller roof section, and again, using scraps, same old thing. This section I'm going to have to use an additional piece of cardboard for the front. Again, I'm cutting this, cutting out the window, doing all that stuff. I did decide to add another window on the side. Did cut this out of the frame that I already glued together, so it does work, but I do think that doing it before attaching it is a little bit better. I'm also building a chimney. For this, I'm using thinner cardboard, again, cereal boxes. I am just drawing out a very basic chimney, and then I'm adding a bunch of sides to it and trimming them down so that everything looks very flush and clean. Also, because the chimney and the fireplace is inside the house, I am having to cut out a box from the roof so that it kind of sticks out from inside, if that makes sense. Moving on, I want this little cottage to be very Tudor inspired, and Tudor houses have a mix of stucco and wood and have these really beautiful geometric outlines. For that, I'm using popsicle sticks. I'm cutting off the ends so that they aren't curved anymore. I can basically have a very long, clean strip. For the two windows at the top, which is going to be the more Tudory stucco side of things, I am also making little frames. So here's the tip: save all of the cutouts for your windows, your door, all that, because it's going to be a perfect template for you to make all the other stuff later. Now we're going to get started on making all of the cobblestone, the stone for the sides of the house. So I wanted to again try to push myself to make this as realistically as I could, And so I wanted to distress the cardboard. I'm using slightly thinner cardboard for this, so it's easy to cut out with scissors. I actually used a metal die to create this really rough texture on the cardboard. But again, get creative. You can use, I'm sure, a ton of different things. I cut 3 different kinds of shapes for these rocks. I used some very jagged ovals almost of different shapes and sizes for the majority of this, but then for the sides, I wanted the sides to be very clean and crisp, so I'm doing the same shape but having a blunt edge so that I can line it up and make sure it's really clean. Around the windows, I want more perfectly shaped ovals so that they create a really nice border. For the edges and the windows, I used a glue gun because I knew exactly where I wanted to position stuff, but I actually just used Elmer's glue for everything else because it takes an eternity to dry, and that actually works to your advantage because it's almost like building a puzzle piece and creating a puzzle at the same time, where you're trying to make sure that things and pieces fit together without huge gaps. And so it allows you to move things around and you don't have to be worried about making mistakes. It takes forever to dry again. You can remove things, you can switch different pieces, wiggle it around, and everything works really well. Moving on to the roof, I'm going to be making a cedar shingled roofing. And again, using thinner cardboard, I'm cutting different strips. Again, I'm wanting this to look very natural, something that has a lot of character. It's not very perfect, so I am making sure that each of these strips are different heights, even using different thicknesses. So much thinner cardboard and some medium cardboards, so it adds a little bit of lift and looks like it's been worn. If there's a piece that falls and it's crooked, I'm just leaving it because again, this is a building that's been there for a while, so it's not going to look brand new. And now we're going to be making those beautiful shapes that you see with Tudor style homes. I wanted to make sure that this was very precise and fit very well, so I made a template out of just regular printer paper, and I cut out all the pieces. I tried to do all my measurements, make sure that everything looked really good, so that I can then use those templates and trace them out on cardboard that is a little bit more of a medium-sized thickness. I actually held it up to the popsicle sticks since I want them to look as similar to each other as possible. As you see, I also left this section right underneath the door blank because I'm going to be making some stairs. Now it's time to put my house onto its platform. This house is going to have a yard and a fence and all those beautiful things. So I actually still want the bottom of the house to be open. I'm making about a 1-inch frame. That way I can still reach inside because I'm going to be doing some other things later on inside the house and I still want to be able to access that area. So now I'm taking that door cutout and using it as a template to create the actual door. I'm cutting out a piece of cardboard, a slightly thinner style, and taking popsicle sticks, I'm cutting them in half, and I intentionally want them to not be perfectly even. I'm wanting it to splinter or curve or do some weird things, and I'm just gluing them in place. This way it looks like pretty natural wood panels. And then it's a little tricky, but with scissors you can very easily cut the popsicle sticks and make sure that you have that nice curved door look. I'm also taking an X-Acto knife and tracing in some wood grain just to make it look as realistic as possible. Next, I'm using some cardboard to create the stone pathway to the cottage. I ended up thinking that the cardboard that I used was a little on the thicker side, so I started ripping it into pieces, so just use something thinner. So unlike the stones on the house, I want to actually crinkle the cardboard so that it has lines in it the way that stones kind of do, and I need to be able to handle it. Before I get into painting, just like I did with the door, I'm going to be making this faux wood grain on all of the wood components of the upper level of the house. I had to make a slight test because I wanted to make the stucco section look like actual stucco. So for this, I wanted to experiment by using some baking soda and glue to create a foundation of texture that I can paint over. I tried a couple different things. I found that you want it to be very dry and you want to stipple without saturating the entire section because then the glue just kind of flows and it just becomes a very big pool of mess, and that doesn't really help with the texture. So after I successfully conducted this experiment and saw that it would look very much like stucco even after painting it over, I mixed together some baking soda and glue in a little container and stippled it on. Again, I'm trying to make streaks, I'm trying to make it very textural. Now, the way that I like to do things when it comes to painting is that I want to add a little bit of contrast and dimension. Again, this is a house that's been lived in, it's been worn, it's in the woods. It has probably algae and dirt and all sorts of gunk all over it. And so I like to make my main shade and then add a little bit of darker shades to make a darker version and a lighter version for highlighting. So starting off with my mid shade, I mixed up a shade with some brown, a little bit of white, a little bit of yellow. I wanted it to look like your typical tan stucco, nothing special. I'm completely covering the area where the baking soda mixture was. And then taking a brush, I'm gonna almost dry brush stipple a darker shade on top. I want to make sure there's not a lot of paint on the brush. And then I'm also doing the same with the highlight color. That way you have a lot of dimensions. I'm also focusing the darker shades around the curvatures, around anything that has overhang so that it looks very, it already is three-dimensional, but even more three-dimensional. Now for the wood panels of the Tudor style home, I'm going to be trying to make it look like state. Again, I want some of the wood to shine through. Most wood doesn't look perfectly like opaque, and so I am taking some paint and then immediately wiping it off with a paper towel. That way you can really easily see through the nice grains that we made and all those little details. And now to move on to painting our stones. Again, I have many different shades of gray here. I'm using straight black. I'm using a very, very light shade that has a tinge of green. Again, I'm thinking moss, algae, using more mid-tone grays. And I actually ended up doing this step twice because everything else in this house is very warm. So I want, again, to have all the colors work pretty well together. And so I ended up taking another direction and adding a little bit of brown paint into each of these shades of gray. So it's a warm tone gray essentially, and restippling over. That way it's not something that looks identical to anything else, but it has a more cohesive look to it. Now, I didn't show before how I added the little stones for the chimney, but I made some very, very round stones and layered them all over each other. I wanted to make sure that it looked different enough from the rest of the house that it looked like its own section. And for this, I also used a different color palette, sticking more with more muted, warmer browns, almost red stones, a little bit of really warm light gray. For the roof, again, I mixed three colors: a mid-tone brown, a very, very dark brown, and then a very light brown. And I basically just, again, with a very rough hand, I'm just washing this all over, switching between the three colors, and then dry brushing over it all. Also, another little note, for projects like this, I have a completely different set of paintbrushes that I use for actually painting. I don't want to use my nice paintbrushes on this because I'm being really rough. We're going to start making our fence. For this, again, I'm using a mix of popsicle sticks and doing the same thing that I did with the door, where I'm cutting them in half. And again, intentionally, I'm breaking them apart. I want them to splinter. I want them to be jagged. And then I'm also using coffee stirrers that are basically more thin versions of popsicle sticks. That way they're really easy to cut. And then I'm using scissors to just clip the tops of all of them so that they're nice and pointed and look pretty eerie. Again, using the same technique of painting over, rubbing off. For this, I'm using a range of brown colors and then some more warm tone gray, and looks pretty realistic. Next, we're gonna be making a couple sweet little pumpkins to have in the front yard. So I'm making these little balls. You want to need the polymer clay for a little while so that it's a little bit more malleable. And then I'm taking balls of different sizes. I'm using this little sculpting tool, but you can use like a toothpick or something else if you want, and creating these ridges around the pumpkin. I'm making sections of 7. You want to keep it an odd number or else it's going to look weird. And again, along with the different sizes, I also want to have slightly different shapes. So some of them I'm smushing down a little bit more, some of them I'm making more round, just adding that diversity. Now, the way that this works is when you bake it, it is about half an hour at 275 per quarter inch. So obviously these pumpkins are all different sizes, so I'm gonna have to stagger the time. Now, I was inspired by some of the pumpkins I actually have in my front porch right now that I found in a really awesome local pumpkin patch. There are some beautiful, almost green muted blue pumpkins, and I love the more terracotta colored pumpkins, and so I want again everything to be more muted, something that would look very cohesive with everything. Also for the front yard, I'm gonna make a couple gravestones because why not? I'm using a bit of foam board. Again, you can find this at like Walmart for like $1, just freehanding different shapes of gravestones. Now again, like everything else in this house, everything is worn, everything has been there in the rain, in the snow, and all of the elements for a very long time, so I want it to look very weathered and old. I'm taking a coffee can and adding a bit of gravel into it and shaking it so that it gets basically beat up by all these stones. Be careful when you open the lid because there's a huge puff of, I don't know, stone smoke. And now I mixed a slightly lighter gray with a slight green tinge. Using a damp paper towel, I am just blotting and streaking this on. We're getting so close to being able to cover the base of our home, but first we have to make our windows. Taking this acetate that I had for another project from last year, cutting them to size for each window, and I tried to think of so many ways that I can make these windows. I originally wanted to use the same lead adhesive strips that I used for making the stain. There's probably a lot better way of doing this. I decided to take the tedious path of individually measuring out all of these little lines and then cutting them out with an X-Acto knife. I just have to paint them over with a more brown shade, and then I am filling the entire piece of acetate once removing the film with glue. So this is almost exactly like making a miniature version of my stained glass. I liked the glue because it's an adhesive, so I'm able to stick the paneling or whatever it's called on top of it, but it also makes it look like glass. It has this really cool reflective surface, which I'm gonna be adding lights, and I know that that's gonna look really cool. I went outside and collected a couple branches. I felt like there was probably nothing more natural and more similar to a tree than an actual piece of a tree. And that way I don't have to paint it, I don't have to do anything, it's kind of just perfect on its own. Now we're gonna start covering the base, and we're so close to finishing this project. If you made it up to this point, leave me a little gravestone emoji. I'm so appreciative of you. For this, I went outside again and collected some of the gravel from our garden. I kind of took the very bottom pieces of gravel. It was rainy that day and it was pretty wet, so I just dumped it out in a piece of parchment paper and baked it in my oven for 200 degrees for a very short amount of time just to dry out all the moisture. I used a mixture of moss and Spanish moss that I got from the dollar store, and I just took different pieces and sections and added them where I wanted to. I had to be really careful around the trees and all the things because this is a small space, so having a pair of tweezers makes it really easy to get into some of the nooks and crannies that are a little awkward. Using some glue from my glue gun, I am adding all of the pumpkins. I wanted to have some framing the entryway and then the rest like a little pumpkin patch. I wanted to add lights. I thought that it would add a really nice feature to have it reflected in all these windows, and for this I just used some fairy light. I was trying to look for thumbtacks and I couldn't find them, so I used sewing pins instead. And thus concludes our video. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by giving me a like, leaving a comment, subscribing if you really like this kind of thing. Anyway, thank you again so much for watching. Let's see our little reveal.